Iran has been trying to surrender to the United States in recent months, but unfortunately it has failed. In the early morning of June 13th, Israel launched a large-scale assassination operation against Iran. Key figures were targeted: Hossein Salami, the commander-in-chief of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Bagheri, Iran's Armed Forces Chief of Staff, and Gholam Ali Rashid, deputy commander of the Iranian Armed Forces. Tragically, all were assassinated. In addition, at least 9 nuclear scientists, including Mohammad Mehdi Tehrankai, a professor at Tehran University, lost their lives. Israel's ability to execute these assassinations with precision suggests that it possesses remarkably detailed intelligence on the itineraries and home addresses of these Iranian officials and scientists, down to the specific floor numbers. This level of penetration indicates that Iran's security has been severely compromised. It is not merely a case of intelligence leakage. There must be high-ranking Iranian officials who have betrayed their country. Following the assassinations, Israel conducted extensive airstrikes on dozens of targets linked to Iran's nuclear program and other military facilities, naming the military operation Lion's Power. Israel justified the strikes as preemptive self-defense, arguing that while Iran had not yet attacked, it was believed to pose an inevitable threat. Thus, Israel claimed it had the right to strike first. In response to the attacks, Iran retaliated, also citing self-defense. Now, both nations are engaged in a war of words on the international stage, each claiming to act in self-defense. Setting aside the rhetorical battles, let us examine the reasons behind Israel's sudden assault on Iran. Since Israel's large-scale airstrike on Iran on October 26, 2024, which ended in a disastrous defeat, Israel had refrained from further action against Iran for 8 months. The primary reason for Israel's attack was Iran's decision to abandon resistance against the United States and seek reconciliation. After Trump assumed power in January 2025, Iran's foreign policy underwent a dramatic shift, with Iran consistently demonstrating goodwill toward the United States. Since April 2025, the armed activities of Iranian-backed groups such as Lebanon's Hezbollah and Hamas have significantly diminished, with only the Houthi forces in Yemen continuing limited operations. On April 8, relations between Iran and Russia soured. The Russian Foreign Ministry declared it had no obligation to provide military assistance to Iran. In retaliation, Iran announced it would cease supplying drone parts to Russia, and the Russia-Iran Joint Missile Factory project, originally scheduled to commence production in 2025, was put on hold. On April 9, the Iranian president publicly stated that Iran does not pursue nuclear weapons and explicitly welcomed American businesses to invest in Iran, promising legal protection. On April 10, Iranian and U.S. representatives held indirect negotiations in Oman, with Omani diplomats serving as intermediaries. On April 19, the second round of negotiations between the United States and Iran took place. On April 25, Trump publicly announced a high probability of reaching an agreement with Iran, touting it as his major political achievement. Following Trump's statement, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu expressed extreme shock and subsequently launched a series of lobbying efforts in the United States, firmly opposing U.S.-Iran reconciliation. On May 4, according to a Washington Post report, Trump dismissed National Security Advisor Waltz, primarily due to his collusion and coordination with Netanyahu to cooperate with Israel's military strikes against Iran and his persistent advocacy for military solutions to the Iranian issue within the Trump administration. Concurrently, Trump and Netanyahu had a public falling out. On May 6, the United States unilaterally announced a ceasefire with the Houthi forces without prior notification to Israel, prompting another public expression of extreme shock from the Israeli side. On May 7, an aerial conflict erupted between India and Pakistan. The following day, Iran's foreign minister visited India and signed the all-weather Strategic Cooperative Partnership Agreement with the country. On May 9, Israeli reports indicated that Trump had severed direct communication channels with Netanyahu, with Israel being blacklisted. Judging from these developments, it appears that the United States and Iran had engaged in very productive discussions. For Iran's sake, the United States went so far as to blacklist Israel, and for the United States' sake, Iran sought to demonstrate goodwill toward India immediately after India's military action against its neighbor and China's important ally, Pakistan. This indicated Iran's willingness to abandon relations with Pakistan and China to court US favor. The United States and Iran must have had very productive talks to go to such lengths for each other. If the US could negotiate with Iran and transform it into a pro-American state, not only would US influence in the Middle East be significantly enhanced, but it would also greatly compress the strategic space of China and Russia. If the US could address the issues of Syria and Iran, it would complete its encirclement of the Middle East, leaving only one sea route for external communication. Consequently, China and Russia's influence in the Middle East would be substantially weakened. China, however, has remained passive. From the beginning of the year when Iran turned against China to the present, China has turned a blind eye to Iran's reconciliatory moves with the US. Even during the critical moment of the India-Pakistan aerial conflict, when Iran openly sided with India, a significant diplomatic event, China remained silent, allowing Iran to act freely. In the early morning of June 13, Israel suddenly launched a large-scale assassination and bombing campaign against Iran, which completely derailed the US-Iran peace talks. The new round of negotiations scheduled for June 15 was cancelled, and Iran was compelled to retaliate against Israel. The United States instructed Israel to attack Iran. 2 days prior to Israel's operation, on the evening of June 11, the US abruptly announced the evacuation of all non-essential personnel from Iraq and approved the withdrawal of non-essential personnel stationed in Bahrain and Kuwait. Trump declared that the Middle East would become very dangerous. Thus, the US was aware of the impending attack on Iran and even publicly signaled its approval of Israel's military actions. This is perplexing. A month ago, the US and Iran were engaged in amicable talks, with the US even blacklisting Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu for Iran's sake. Why the sudden shift to attacking Iran? Not only were numerous Iranian figures assassinated, but Iran also suffered extensive bombings. Based on Iran's public statement on June 12, the conditions proposed by the US at the negotiation table were too demanding for Iran to accept. The US even threatened to provoke a military conflict if Iran did not comply. Undeterred, Iran asserted that if the US dared to impose military conflict, Iran would attack all US military bases in the Middle East. Then, the Iranian president made a shocking statement. He declared that Iran would reach a nuclear agreement with the US at all costs. Iran would not develop nuclear weapons but would not tolerate any pressure. This statement was both defiant and timid. The US threatened military action, and Israel was poised for strikes. Yet Iran claimed it would not reach an agreement with the US at all costs, signaling its readiness for conflict. Prepared for war and adopting a tough stance, Iran still announced it would not develop nuclear weapons. After enduring decades of nuclear sanctions without acquiring nuclear weapons, what was the purpose of enduring such sanctions? We are indifferent to Iran's rationale. Israel, however, was delighted and launched an attack the following day, delivering a heavy blow to Iran. Based on evidence from the past few months, Israel must have played a significant role in sabotaging the US-Iran peace talks. Its approach was not to forcibly prevent the US and Iran from negotiating, as such attempts had already led to Israel being blacklisted by Trump. I speculate that Israel lured the US into demanding higher concessions at the negotiating table, arguing that greater military pressure on Iran could force Tehran to accept more of Trump's conditions. This aroused Trump's greed, leading him to suddenly demand concessions from Iran that he had not previously mentioned. He threatened military action if Iran did not comply. These demands were unacceptable to Iran. My speculation is supported by Trump's own remarks, as he explicitly threatened Iran with continued military strikes. A key reason for Israel's determination to undermine the US-Iran peace talks is its belief that peace between Iran and the US would not only fail to enhance its own security but also pose a significant threat. At least, this is what Israel perceives. Israel will not permit Iran to reconcile with the US. Should Iran attempt to show weakness toward the US, Israel will attack. Another critical reason for Israel's boldness in attacking Iran is Iran's conciliatory stance toward the US. Wanting to fight and daring to fight are interrelated. While both stem from Iran's attempts to reconcile with the US, the logic differs. After suffering large-scale assassinations and airstrikes by Israel, Iran, in a fit of anger, raised its familiar flags and launched numerous ballistic missiles at Israel. A few missiles did hit the Israeli capital, but they were largely hypersonic missiles. Ordinary ballistic missiles struggled to penetrate Israel's air defense network. It seems Iran possesses the capacity to retaliate, but from a military perspective, this perception is flawed. Hypersonic missiles are not deployed in this manner. China has invested years in hypersonic missile technology primarily to target aircraft carriers. The advantage of hypersonic missiles lies in their strong penetration capabilities, while their disadvantage is their high cost. Compared to conventional missiles, hypersonic missiles are only meaningful when targeting aircraft carriers, as carriers are extremely vulnerable. However, when used to bombard ground targets, the explosive power of hypersonic missiles does not surpass that of conventional missiles. The resulting damage and casualties are relatively minor, and the cost-effectiveness of such bombings is poor. Israel deployed a total of 200 fighter jets, dropping approximately 330 conventional missiles and even aerial bombs on over 100 targets in Iran, which were largely unintercepted. Iran, on the other hand, launched 100 or 200 ballistic missiles, with only a few hitting their marks. Israel, wealthy and backed by the US, conducted bombings at minimal cost using aircraft. Iran, however, could only retaliate with hypersonic missiles. The cost disparity is stark. If the confrontation continues, Iran, with limited financial resources, will suffer the most and will likely be the first to exhaust its capabilities. The crux is that Iran lacks air superiority, allowing Israeli planes to bomb Iran without hindrance. Iran cannot even intercept Israeli aircraft, let alone missiles. The hypersonic missiles that Iran can deploy against Israel are prohibitively expensive and were not designed to carry conventional warheads for ground bombardment. Recall Israel's large-scale airstrike on Iran on October 26, 2024. That night, a spectacular fireworks display took place in Iran's capital as none of the hundreds of missiles launched by Israeli aircraft successfully hit their targets. Israel's bombing coordinates kept retreating, pushing the limits of this mysterious air defense force until the bombs finally landed near the Iranian border. This formidable air defense force, which stunned the world, originated from an unknown channel. However, China's CCTV reporters were present in the Iranian capital at night, broadcasting the entire event live. Since that day, Israel refrained from launching airstrikes on Iran until June 13, 2025. The primary reason for Israel's boldness this time was Iran's conciliatory stance toward the US, which led to the disappearance of the mysterious and powerful air defense force that had previously astonished the world. Consequently, Iran's capital was brutally bombed. Most of the missiles Israel used to attack Iran this time hit their targets. Israel deployed 5 waves of aircraft, totaling 200 sorties of fighter jets, carrying only conventional cruise missiles. In contrast, when India launched an airstrike on Pakistan on May 7 this year, it dispatched a massive fleet of 60 aircraft in a single wave, armed with supersonic missiles at Mach 3.5. In the end, Pakistan shot down 6 fighter jets cleanly and undamaged, directly intimidating them into retreat. Only 18 J-10s were deployed across Pakistan, with only a few engaging the enemy head-on. If Iran had 10 J-10s, a significant number of Israel's attacking planes would have been shot down, and with the protection of its air defense forces, the capital would have been secure. Although China has always adhered to a non-alignment policy, since China has vigorously promoted reconciliation in the Middle East and helped Iran eliminate strategic risks, it has also dispatched mysterious air defense forces to establish a missile no-fly zone in the Iranian capital. Since this mysterious force was willing to actively deploy to the Iranian capital to assist, if Iran truly wished to purchase J-10s, China would certainly sell them and equip Iran with the entire system. However, after this wave of superior air defense directly intimidated Israel, Iran believed it could be on equal footing with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. It first openly turned against Russia and then directly sided with India during the India-Pakistan aerial conflict, constantly seeking US favor. A nation's actions cannot be simply labeled as good or evil. We cannot hastily accuse Iran of treachery. The reason for Iran's behavior is its belief that it can manipulate the conflicts among the 5 permanent members to gain the greatest benefits for itself. The core idea is that Iran intends to use the 5 permanent members as pawns while positioning itself as the chess master. It is a good strategy, but unfortunately, Iran lacks the capability. Thus, China simply ignored Iran and allowed it to submit to the US. The reason Israel could deal Iran such a severe blow is not because Israel is overwhelmingly stronger than Iran. The primary reason is Israel's support from the US. Israel is willing to serve as the agent of US interests in the Middle East, with the two nations so closely aligned that they can almost be regarded as one. The reason Iran could brutally attack Israel on October 26 last year and intercept hundreds of Israeli missiles with a spectacular display was due to a power that could rival the US standing behind Iran. The US was on good terms with Iran before May but turned hostile in June. The primary reason was that when the India-Pakistan aerial conflict erupted on May 7, Iran signed a strategic partnership agreement with India the following day. Based on this alone, the US and Israel could conclude that China would no longer support Iran, and the mysterious air defense forces would no longer mysteriously appear in the Iranian capital. Since Iran had fallen out with Russia and lost China's support, the situation differed from that of April and May. With Iran's diminished power, why should it still enjoy the same favorable conditions as before? Thus, the conditions had to be adjusted upward to ensure fairness. This aligns not only with Trump's nature but also with the fundamental principles of state transactions. The US does not believe Iran will remain loyal. Negotiating conditions is inherently a transaction. The transaction must be equitable. One can only obtain as many concessions as their bargaining chips allow. Therefore, it is logical for the US to suddenly raise its demands. If Iran refuses to comply, it would be seen as ignorant of international norms and mentally unsound. Hence, Trump believes allowing Israel to teach Iran a lesson will help Iran face reality and return to the negotiating table. Both Iran and Trump genuinely wished to reach an agreement. Both parties had the motivation to reconcile, but the ultimate outcome was the US instructing Israel to discipline Iran. The reason for disciplining Iran is to compel it to sign the agreement properly, preventing it from suffering even greater losses at the hands of the US. This is for Iran's own good, do you understand? Do not view this as overbearing. If one considers the issue from the US perspective, such thinking is natural and even well-intentioned. China understands how the US thinks and what it will do, so it ignores Iran's conciliatory stance toward the US, allowing Iran to act freely. Iran's problem is not merely its weakness or internal divisions. The more significant issue is that despite its weakness and disunity, Iran persists in believing it is an independent force in the world, the successor to the Persian Empire, the natural leader of the Middle East, and that it can sit at the table as an equal with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Thus, there is a reason why Iran has suffered repeated defeats in recent years. Having chosen to play the role of a leader, it must bear the corresponding responsibilities and obligations. It must be capable of controlling the situation on its own and cannot rely on others for everything. Israel is different. It has no desire to be a leader, nor does it believe it can be on equal footing with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. When faced with problems, it seeks US assistance. When severely beaten, high-ranking officials rush to the White House for help, crying and clinging to the US like children. At the United Nations, when the Israeli representative was delivering a passionate speech, upon hearing the Chinese representative begin to speak, the Israeli delegate immediately fell silent, nervously putting on his headphones to listen to what the Chinese representative had to say, as docile as a primary school student. Thus, it is not surprising that Iran has been repeatedly attacked by Israel. In terms of maintaining good relations with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Israel is indeed much more astute than Iran. You will find that 4 of the 5 permanent members, China, Russia, the UK, and France, have expressed clear opposition and condemnation of Israel's inhumane actions. Yet none are willing to take Israel's life. On the other hand, Iran, which is beaten daily, is truly pitiable. Among the 4 permanent members that have condemned Israel, none have condemned Iran, but none are willing to support Iran either. Iran's national mindset can be described as that of the Indian in the Middle East. It lacks strength but is arrogant and self-righteous. For geopolitical needs, we must indeed support Iran, but such a temperament must be tempered. We need not take any action to temper Iran's character. We simply need to ignore it, and the United States will handle the matter. Only when all Iranians recognize reality, unify their thoughts, and completely abandon their illusions will Iran become the friend we need.